My neighbor warned me never to answer that radio frequency. But when it turned itself on at 2 a.m., I realized someone out there already knew my name. For as long as I can remember, the man living next door was the kind of presence most people overlook. Not because he was unkind, or cold, or strange, quite the opposite. He was polite in that soft, old-fashioned way that made you straighten your posture without realizing it. Every morning, he stepped outside precisely at 7:15, adjusting the collar of his worn navy cardigan before bending down to collect the newspaper from his walkway. He trimmed his lawn with an almost mathematical precision, pushing the mower in perfect lines, never leaving a single uneven row. And whenever our schedules aligned and we both reached the mailbox at the same time, he offered a quiet good morning and a small, courteous nod. Nothing more, nothing less. He lived in a bubble of silence so gently maintained that I assumed it was all he'd ever known. In my mind, he was the template for every old man in every quiet neighborhood across the country. Retired. Peaceful. Predictable. A man who drank tea instead of coffee, who ate dinner at 5:30 sharp, and who probably spent his afternoons watching history documentaries and complaining about the price of groceries. There was nothing about him that hinted at secrets or danger or shadows from another life. He was simply ordinary. Perfectly, comfortably ordinary. And in a world where everything changes too fast, people like him feel like anchors, steady, unmoving, familiar. But the thing about ordinary people is that we never question what came before their stillness. We never wonder what shaped it, what carved the quiet into their bones. We assume the calm has always been there, when often it's the aftermath of storms we could never imagine. I didn't think about any of this at the time, of course. Why would I? He was my neighbor, not a mystery to solve. I waved, he waved, and life stayed simple. Until the day it didn't. It happened on a Thursday, a completely forgettable Thursday that, in retrospect, was the hinge in the door that separated the world I thought I knew from the one I was about to step into. I remember coming home later than usual, the sky that strange bluish-gray color right before dusk settles. His car was parked crooked in the driveway, which immediately caught my attention because he never, and I mean never, left anything out of alignment. I didn't think much of it until I saw him lifting a grocery bag that was clearly too heavy for him. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from age, and the bag looked like it would break at any second. I walked over automatically. Here, let me help you with that. He blinked at me through thick lenses, surprised but grateful. Oh, thank you. I wasn't expecting anyone to be home yet. We carried the bags inside together. He moved slowly, carefully, as if every step required deliberate thought. The house smelled like old paper and peppermint tea, a comforting but strangely nostalgic scent. The interior looked exactly how I imagined it, tidy, symmetrical, slightly outdated, filled with quiet routines. But then I noticed the kitchen table, and everything I thought I knew about him flickered like a dying light bulb. The table was covered. Not with magazines or mail or crossword puzzles like any other elderly man's might be, but with notebooks. Dozens of them. Stacked in uneven towers, some opened, some closed, all aged to a shade of yellow that only time could create. Their covers were worn, corners frayed, pages swollen from humidity. But the thing that struck me wasn't their age, it was what was written inside. Numbers. Symbols. Grids. Overlapping patterns. Foreign letters arranged in sequences that didn't look random at all. It looked like the notes of someone trying to solve the universe. Or hide something from it. I laughed awkwardly, gesturing toward the mess. Planning a heist or something? I expected him to laugh back. To wave it off, to say they were puzzles, or old accounting notes, or something ordinary. Instead, he set the grocery bag on the counter, adjusted his glasses, and said with unsettling calmness. I used to do this for a living. Just like that. No build-up. No dramatic pause. No awareness that he had just cracked open a reality I didn't know existed. I stood there frozen, my eyes bouncing between him and the notebooks as if they'd suddenly start glowing. His voice was steady, unwavering, almost clinical, the voice of someone who had repeated this truth only a handful of times in his entire life. And in that moment, something in his expression shifted, so subtly I almost missed it, a glimmer of something old, heavy, and sharp. Before I could ask what he meant, he continued, as casually as someone describing their old job at a hardware store. I was a cryptographer. Cold War era. Long time ago now. The world around me seemed to pause. My heartbeat did the opposite. And that was the moment I realized. The quiet old man next door was quiet for a reason. Because people who have held secrets that big rarely speak loudly ever again. I don't remember walking to the kitchen table. One moment I was standing near the counter, trying to understand what my neighbor had just said, and the next my hand was resting on the edge of one of those yellowed notebooks. The paper felt brittle beneath my fingertips, like something older than I had any right to touch. I lifted the top page slightly, careful not to tear it, and the faint scent of dust and ink rose into the air. It reminded me of libraries, ancient ones, the kind with shelves that whisper when you pass by. These, I started, but the words cracked in my throat. My brain scrambled for the right question. What do you ask a man who casually admits he spent his youth decoding enemy communications? These are from back then? Yes, he said simply. He didn't even glance at the notebooks, just continued sorting groceries with the precision of someone who never wasted movement. Some of my notes. Training exercises. Part of the job. The job. He said it like he used to stock shelves at a supermarket, not unravel encrypted Soviet transmissions in the middle of the night. I turned the page again, slowly. Rows of symbols stared back at me. Some were numbers, some letters, some shapes I didn't even recognize. Triangles. Squares. Arrows. Lines divided into segments. It looked chaotic at first, but after a moment, I noticed the structure beneath it, like tangled threads that somehow formed a pattern if you stared long enough. I whispered, more to myself than to him, this is complicated. He chuckled quietly. You have no idea. Then he walked past me and gently lifted a notebook from the bottom of the tallest stack, an impressive feat, considering how close it was to collapsing. He placed it on the table in front of me like a teacher laying out a textbook. The cover was cracked, the spiral rusted. He tapped it with 2 fingers. This one was the first system I learned, he said. Caesar shift. Simple substitution. Old as Rome. I blinked. They actually used that? In the Cold War? No, he said. But everyone starts somewhere. There was something strange about the way he said it. Not nostalgic. Not proud. Almost guarded. Like every memory had a shadow behind it. Oh wait. I looked around his kitchen again, really looked this time. Noticing the details I had missed when I assumed he was just another elderly man with too much time on his hands. Bookshelves lined with binders. A radio sitting on the counter, not a modern one, but a shortwave receiver, the kind hobbyists use to listen to frequencies that most people don't even know exist. Maps pinned to the wall with faint pencil marks, circles, arrows, coordinates. He noticed my eyes lingering on the radio and spoke with a tone so calm it chilled me. I still tune in sometimes. Old habit. You never really stop listening. Something in the room shifted. Not physically, but in atmosphere. Like a curtain moving in an invisible breeze. Like history itself exhaling. I swallowed hard. How long did you do this work? Long enough, he said. Then, after a pause. Too long, maybe. For a moment, the silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It held something dense, something unsaid. Something lived. The kind of silence people carry when their past isn't just memories, it's ghosts. He motioned for me to sit, so I did. He sat across from me, folding his hands neatly on the table. A professor. A mentor. A man who had spent decades with secrets stitched into his bones. You're curious, he observed. That's good. Curiosity was the first requirement for the job. I laughed nervously. I'm not trying to become a spy. He smiled, but the smile never fully reached his eyes. Oh, you don't choose that kind of thing, he said softly. It chooses you. Usually when you're too young to understand the consequences. I didn't know how to respond to that. So instead, I asked the question that had been burning a hole in my head since the moment he revealed his past. Why did you keep all these? He leaned back in his chair, gaze drifting to the notebooks like they were old, stubborn memories. Because history disappears if we let it, he said. And because one day, someone might want to learn. Learn what? He lifted his eyes to mine, steady, sharp, unexpectedly intense. How to see the world the way I did, he answered. How to understand what hides behind noise. Behind patterns. Behind silence. Then, almost casually, he added. And maybe how to protect something worth protecting. The air thickened between us. A tension I couldn't name settled into the room. Not dangerous, just heavy. Like the weight of a door cracking open to a world I wasn't sure I was ready to see. He reached into another notebook and flipped to a page filled with shifting letters. He tapped a sequence with his pen. Tell me, he said. Do you want to learn how to read this? My heart thudded. Read it? I can't even tell where the words are supposed to be. That's the point, he said, and his smile this time was real, even a little mischievous. If you can read what isn't meant to be read, you understand more than most people ever will. He waited. Patient. Still. Offering a doorway I hadn't realized I'd been standing in front of my whole life. And for reasons I still don't fully understand. I stepped through it. I want to learn, I said. His nod was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Then come back next Thursday, he said. We'll begin properly. That was the moment it all started. The shift. The unraveling. The discovery that the quietest man on my street once held the loudest secrets in the world. And somehow. Some impossible way. I had just become part of his world. The following Thursday arrived with an odd kind of anticipation, the sort that made every hour feel slightly off balance. I spent the entire day feeling like I had been handed a secret I wasn't entirely sure I deserved. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt bigger than that, like I had accidentally stumbled into a forgotten corner of history and someone chose not to push me back out. When the clock hit 5:58 p.m., I locked my front door and crossed the narrow strip of grass between our houses. I don't know why I hesitated before knocking. Maybe I was worried he'd changed his mind. Maybe I was worried I'd imagined everything he'd told me. But I knocked, and only 2 seconds passed before the door opened. He was already waiting. He wasn't dressed dramatically. He didn't transform into some cinematic version of a spy. He looked exactly the same, the navy cardigan, the pressed khaki slacks, the glasses that always slid down his nose. But something in his eyes told me he had slipped into another self, the self he used to be. The self beneath the silence. Right on time, he said with a small smile. Punctuality matters. I stepped inside, expecting the same cluttered table of notebooks. Instead, I froze. The table was cleared. Completely. Every notebook, every sheet, every pencil had been arranged into precise stacks, each labeled with little slips of paper. The room didn't feel like a kitchen anymore. It felt like a study, or a briefing room. The lights were dimmer, the air somehow cooler. And at the center of the table sat a single open notebook, its ink still crisp despite its age. This, he said, tapping the page lightly, is where we begin. I sat down slowly. You're really going to teach me this? If you want to learn, he said. Not many people ask questions anymore. Most look, but they don't see. They hear, but don't listen. I wasn't sure if he meant it metaphorically or literally. With him, it could have been either. He handed me a pencil, not a mechanical one, not a ballpoint, but a wooden number 2 pencil sharpened to a perfect point. Everything starts with pencil and paper, he explained. Computers make people careless. They rely on speed, not understanding. I nodded and held the pencil like it was something delicate. He began with Caesar shifts, simple substitutions where every letter moves forward by a fixed number. It should have been easy, the kind of thing you learn in school for fun. But he didn't teach it like a game. He taught it like a philosophy. Look at the pattern, he said. The beauty of a Caesar shift isn't the shift itself, but the predictability that hides inside the unpredictability. I stared at the letters. Shift by 3. A becomes D. B becomes E. C becomes F. But with him explaining it, it didn't feel elementary. It felt like unlocking a door that had been locked most of my life. We moved on to Vigenère ciphers, a method that layers shifts on top of each other using a keyword. He spoke about them like they were alive. This one is elegant, he said. Simple on the surface, complex underneath. Like most things worth understanding. I watched his hands as he demonstrated the table, rows of letters shifting in perfect grids. He remembered every line, every position, every shift, without pausing. His mind, even at 84, moved faster than mine ever had. Between lessons, he sprinkled bits of his past, not full stories, but fragments of a life lived in shadows. This cipher was used to confuse listeners on long-range transmissions, he said once, almost casually. On another page, he pointed at a symbol and said, this one saved a man's life, though he never knew it. I didn't ask questions when he said things like that. Not because I wasn't curious. But because I sensed the weight behind those memories, the kind of weight you don't interrupt. We continued for nearly an hour before he pushed the notebook toward me. Your turn, he said. My stomach dropped. You want me to decode something? Of course. His tone was amused. What did you think you were here for? Tea? He slid me a page containing a string of letters that looked like nonsense. KMTRZQAYX. 10 letters, he said. Caesar shift. Try shifting by 1. I shifted each letter back by 1 and wrote the result. JL, no, wait, JL. My pencil hovered uncertainly. He didn't correct me. He didn't rush me. He just waited. By the third attempt, I got it. The letters fell into place. A simple word emerged. Knowledge. I stared at it. At the way it had once been scrambled into nothingness. At the way a simple pattern brought it back to life. I looked up at him, half expecting him to laugh at my amazement. He didn't. He only nodded. That's what cryptography is, he said quietly. Order inside chaos. Meaning inside noise. Something warmed inside my chest. A strange mixture of excitement and humility. He watched me for a long moment, then added. And it requires more than intelligence. It requires patience. Discipline. Curiosity. The ability to tolerate confusion without giving up. Most people can't do that. What makes you think I can? He raised an eyebrow. You're still sitting here, aren't you? I didn't have an answer for that. But he wasn't wrong. He closed the notebook gently, like closing the cover of a memory. That's all for tonight, he said. Next week we moved to book ciphers. More challenging, but far more interesting. I stood slowly. My brain buzzed, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of buzzing that comes after discovering something new, something unexpected, something alive. As I walked to the door, he said one last thing. Something quiet. Something I wasn't sure I was meant to hear. It feels good to teach again. I turned, but he was already rearranging the notebooks, shoulders slightly hunched, as if hiding the emotion that had slipped through. I stepped outside into the cool night air with a strange, electric realization. This wasn't just a hobby for him. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a man passing on a legacy he never expected anyone to care about again. And somehow, some impossibly delicate way, I had become the one he chose. The second Thursday felt different before it even began. Maybe it was because all week long, I found myself thinking about symbols, patterns, and shifting letters more than anything else. Or maybe it was because something about Mr. W's expression during our last goodbye stuck with me, something that didn't belong to a quiet man living out his final years in a peaceful neighborhood. Something older. Heavier. Something I hadn't earned the right to name yet. By the time I knocked on his door again, the anticipation wasn't just excitement. There was a sliver of unease threaded through it, the kind that comes when you realize you've stepped into someone else's unfinished story. He opened the door before I'd even lowered my hand. You're early, he said, but his tone suggested approval. It's only 2 minutes. 2 minutes early is still early. He stepped aside to let me in. Punctuality, remember. The kitchen looked exactly the same as last week, orderly, deliberate, like the room itself had been designed by a mathematician. But the table wasn't set up with Caesar shifts or simple letter patterns this time. Instead, a single thick, leather-bound book sat in the center, its spine worn to softness, the pages fanned slightly as if they had absorbed more stories than they could hold. A book cipher. Today, he said, pulling out a chair for me, you learn how to hide messages in plain sight. I sat down slowly. He placed the book in front of me, tapping the cover with a knuckle. Open it anywhere. I did. The pages were filled with tiny print, the kind of dense text that would take months to read properly. Before I could even scan the first paragraph, he spoke again. Pick a word. Any word. I pointed. He nodded. Then he wrote down a series of numbers. Page, line, word. He slid the paper toward me. That is how book ciphers work. You select a book, one both sender and receiver own, and turn words into coordinates. Anyone who intercepts the number sees nothing but numbers. No context. No meaning. I stared at the code. It was absurdly simple. And absurdly brilliant. How often did you use this? I asked. His eyes flickered, just barely. Often enough. He leaned forward, flipping through the book until he reached a dog-eared page. This one, he said, tapping the text, saved more lives than any machine we ever built. A chill crawled up my spine. Not because of the words themselves. But because of the way he said it. Soft. Unsure. Almost reverent. Lives? I asked. He didn't answer right away. He pushed the book aside and began gathering a stack of papers I hadn't noticed before, old telegrams, faded pencil notes, and what looked like copied fragments of radio transmissions. The world was loud back then, he finally said. Everyone talking at once. Governments. Militaries. Agents. Double agents. Third parties. Fourth parties. Some friend, some foe, some pretending to be both. He laid the documents out like puzzle pieces. When you're surrounded by that much noise, he continued, your job isn't to listen to everything. Your job is to know which sound matters. He tapped a handwritten page of numbers. One night, a message came through. Not unusual on its own. Just static and code. But something about it felt wrong. Transmission was shorter. Colder. Almost rushed. What was it? I asked, leaning forward. His eyes didn't leave the page. A warning, he said. Encrypted in a way we'd never seen before. But the pattern, he tapped his temple. The pattern wasn't new. It was hidden. Quiet. Buried beneath noise. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it. He slid a sheet of paper toward me. The ink was faded but still readable, clusters of numbers grouped like coordinates. Book cipher? I whispered. A variation of it, he corrected. Someone improvised in a hurry. I tried to picture him younger, leaning over a desk, the glow of machines and radios humming around him, decoding messages while the rest of the world slept. I tried to imagine the weight of knowing that a number out of place, a letter misinterpreted, could mean more than a mistake. It could mean the difference between life and death. And the strange thing was, I could imagine it. Maybe because of the way he spoke. Maybe because the room seemed to lean into the story. Or maybe because his silence, his unsettling, ever-present silence, now made sense. People don't become quiet for no reason. I finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the first notebook I'd touched. Did you ever lose anyone? Because of a message? His movement stilled. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't look at me. He just stared down at the sheet in his hands, an old message that had survived long after the men who wrote it were gone. Then he said quietly, everyone lost someone back then. My breath caught. He continued, barely above a whisper. That's why I stopped. I didn't know what he meant by stopped working, stopped decoding, stopped listening, but his voice carried a kind of exhaustion that wasn't physical. A kind of weight that time alone doesn't lift. He closed the notebook. That's enough of the past, he said with a small, hollow smile. Let's get back to the fun part. But I knew then that the past wasn't gone for him. Not really. It sat in the corner of the room like a quiet shadow, patient and unmovable. And as he began teaching me how to encode our own message into the text, I realized something. This wasn't just a hobby for him. This wasn't nostalgia. This was the only way he knew how to keep those memories from swallowing him whole. He was teaching me cryptography. But he was also teaching me something else. How to carry silence. How to read between lines. How to understand the things people don't say. And I had no idea yet just how much I was going to need that. The third Thursday should have felt routine by then. I should have expected the precise atmosphere, the carefully arranged table, the sharpened pencil waiting next to a fresh sheet of paper. I should have expected his calm voice explaining how book ciphers evolved, or how one-time pads could never be broken if used correctly. But something was wrong even before I knocked. His house was lit, but only dimly, as if he hadn't meant to leave the lights on. One lamp near the living room window flickered faintly, casting an uneven amber glow through the curtains. And beneath that soft light, I heard something. A low hum. Not a refrigerator. Not an air conditioner. Not the faint vibration of an old heater. It was a radio. A shortwave radio. One that shouldn't have been on. I hesitated, hand hovering over the door. Part of me wanted to turn back. Part of me already sensed that this night was going to be different, in ways I wasn't prepared for. Before I could knock, the door opened. He stood there, not surprised, not startled, but distant, like he had been expecting me for hours, yet had forgotten why. You're here, he said softly. There was no lecture about punctuality this time. Inside, the house felt colder. Not physically, atmospherically. Like the air had grown heavier. The radio was on the kitchen counter, dial turned to a frequency marked with a handwritten note, 74.86, do not erase. A strange mix of static and intermittent tones buzzed through the speaker. It sounded random, but the longer I listened, the more deliberate it felt, like a rhythm with too many missing beats. I pointed to it. Why is the radio on? He didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at it, as if the speaker were a window instead of a box of wires and circuits. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. I haven't heard this frequency in years. Years. Plural. As in, something that shouldn't return had returned. I swallowed. Is it, from back then? Back then. He almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Everything is back then when you get old. He walked to the counter and turned the volume slightly higher. The static expanded, then contracted, like a breath struggling to form. Beneath it, faint taps, evenly spaced, appeared and vanished. Tap. Tap. Tap tap. Silence. Tap. Morse code. I didn't know enough to translate it. but I knew enough to recognize it. Someone is tapping, I whispered. Someone is trying, he corrected. He shut the radio off abruptly and the silence that followed felt unnervingly loud. Come, he said, motioning toward the table. The usual notebooks were waiting, but not the same ones as last time. These were older. Much older. The covers darker. The edges more frayed. Some were tied together with string, as if they had once been part of classified files. This isn't part of the lesson, is it? I asked. No, he said. But you need to understand. He opened a notebook to a page of densely written symbols. Some letters were underlined. Some circled. Some crossed out. It looked different from his usual organized notes. Almost chaotic. This, he said, was the hardest message I ever decoded. I leaned closer. What was it? For the first time since I'd known him, he hesitated. Then, quietly, he said. A goodbye. The word sat between us like a living thing. Heavy. Threaded with sorrow. Rooted in something he clearly wasn't ready to talk about. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. I could see the memory in his shoulders, in the way his hands tightened, in the way his voice softened. I decided not to push him. I learned by then that an old man's silence can hold more truth than most people's words. He switched gears suddenly, placing a pencil in front of me. Tonight we work with one-time pads, he said. Unbreakable ciphers, if used correctly. His tone had sharpened. Not harsh, but focused. For the next hour he explained the system, how each letter corresponded to a purely random number, how the key could only be used once, how even the world's most powerful computers couldn't crack it without the proper key. But something was off. He made mistakes. Not big mistakes, small ones. Repeating himself. Losing his place. Tapping the table with his finger in a pattern that didn't match the lesson. Looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear in the doorway. At one point, I asked him a simple question: what happens if two people accidentally use the same key twice? He froze. Literally froze. His hands suspended midair. Then he closed the notebook and said quietly, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about what? He stood abruptly. Lesson's over. But we just. I said it's over. He wasn't angry. He wasn't frustrated. He was afraid. Fear doesn't look the same on everyone. On him, it looked like cracked composure, something that wasn't supposed to break. He walked to the radio, staring at the blank dial as if he were listening to something only he could hear. After a long, trembling breath, he finally spoke. I thought the world forgot this frequency, he said. Thought it was buried. Gone. Silent. I stepped closer. What does it mean that it's active again? He turned slowly to face me, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked older than 84. It means someone out there still remembers, he whispered. And if they remember, they might be looking. Looking for what? I asked. The corner of his mouth twitched into something between a frown and a sad smile. For me. The room felt colder. The air heavier. Something invisible shifted around us. Then he straightened himself, as if tucking the fear back into the pocket of his cardigan. Go home for tonight, he said. And keep your radio off. No matter what you hear. I wanted to ask 100 questions. But the look in his eyes stopped me. I stepped out into the night, the door closing behind me with a soft click that sounded far too final. As I walked back to my house, the quiet felt wrong. Too deep. Too wide. Too intentional. And for the first time since our lessons began, I realized that whatever world he had pulled me into was not just history. It was still alive. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't done with him yet. I barely slept after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glow of his radio dial and heard that faint tap-tap in the static, Morse code breathing through the noise like something alive. I didn't know Morse, but I didn't need to. The fear in his voice had told me more than any translation ever could. But by morning, a new fear settled in. What if he needed help and I had walked away? By midday, the guilt was too loud to ignore. I paced the hallway for almost 10 minutes before finally grabbing my jacket and stepping outside. His house looked the same as always, with its immaculate garden and quiet windows, and yet something felt off. The curtains were drawn tighter. The mailbox was empty. And the air around the house felt heavier than the weather could explain. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Finally, I tried the doorknob. It was locked, which wasn't unusual, but the silence behind it felt wrong. Not peaceful. Not calm. Vacant. I hovered there for another moment, then left him be. Maybe he needed rest. Maybe I was imagining danger where there was none. Maybe the static had been nothing but atmospheric noise. Maybe. But that night, everything changed. At 2:14 a.m., a faint tapping sound woke me. I sat up, heart pounding so fast it hurt. At first I thought someone was knocking at my door, but then I realized, the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from my radio. I didn't remember turning the radio on. I never turned the radio on. I walked toward it slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. The device was old, dusty, barely working, something I kept only because I'd found it at a yard sale years ago. But tonight, the dial glowed a faint blue. The speakers crackled. Tap. Tap. Tap tap. Silence. Tap. Exactly the rhythm from his kitchen. My throat tightened. He had told me, specifically, to keep my radio off. No matter what you hear. I turned it off instantly. But the moment I stepped away, it turned itself back on. A cold wave ran through me, the kind of fear that slips under your skin like ice. I unplugged it. The light stayed on. That's when I realized something impossible. The radio wasn't receiving a frequency. It was being forced onto one. A frequency marked in his kitchen notebook. 74.86 megahertz. The one he labeled, "Do not erase." I grabbed the radio with both hands and slammed the power switch again, but the tapping continued, steady, patient, intentional. Not random noise. Not interference. A message. A message that wasn't meant for me. I stared at the glowing dial as something unspoken, something ancient and instinctive, whispered in the back of my mind. This isn't about you. This is about him. And they found him. That thought struck so hard my breath stopped. If someone from his past was reaching through the static, if someone on the other end believed he was still listening, then leaving the radio on last night was not an accident. I threw on my jacket and raced across the grass to his front door. My hand shook as I banged on it, once, twice, 3 times. No answer. I called his name. Nothing. The radio in my house was still tapping. Faster now. Urgent. I pounded on the door again until my knuckles throbbed. And just when I was about to break the kitchen window to climb inside, the door lock clicked softly. The door opened a crack. He stood there, but not the version of him I knew. His cardigan was wrinkled. His eyes unfocused. His breathing shallow, like someone who had spent hours pacing. You shouldn't be here, he whispered. The tapping from my house grew louder, I could hear it from his doorway. You said to come back Thursdays, I tried to joke weakly. No, he said. Not tonight. Not after that frequency. He swallowed hard. They shouldn't know I'm alive. Who? My voice cracked. Who's sending messages? Who's trying to reach you? He closed his eyes as if in pain. People who made promises they couldn't keep, he said. People who never wanted the past to stay buried. The tapping kept going, faster, almost frantic. I didn't understand Morse code. But I didn't have to. The message was calling him. Pulling him. Dragging him back into something he had tried to escape decades ago. Then, for the first time since our lessons began, he grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. His eyes suddenly clear. Listen to me, he said. Whatever happens, whatever you see, do not answer that message. Why not? Because once you enter a conversation, he whispered, you become part of the story. His voice trembled. And nobody walks out of that story unscathed. Before I could say another word, he shut the door. Hard. The radio in my house fell silent at the exact same moment. And I realized, with a chill that spread from my spine to my fingertips, that the past he carried was not just heavy. It was hunting him. And now, it had started looking at me too. For 2 days, he didn't leave his house. The blinds stayed shut. The lights remained dim. No newspapers vanished from his driveway. No quiet lawnmower hummed in the morning. He had vanished into that silence he wore like a second skin. But on the 3rd day, just as paranoia began replacing concern, something happened. A small envelope, thin, brittle, almost weightless, slid through the gap beneath my front door. No knock. No sound. No footsteps walking away. Just the envelope. My name wasn't written on it. There was only a sequence of numbers. 74.86/31 to 17, 4. I recognized the frequency immediately. 74.86 megahertz. The forbidden one. The other numbers, 31, 17, 4, were coordinates. Page. Line. Word. A book cipher. My hand shook as I grabbed the only book both he and I had handled together, the thick leather-bound relic from Lesson 2. Page 31. Line 17. Word 4. My eyes scanned the page. The 4th word was run. A cold pressure gripped my chest. I flipped the envelope over. Something inside rattled softly. I tore it open carefully and a folded sheet slid out. Old, yellow. Worn at the edges. The ink faded but legible. A cipher. His handwriting. The same precise strokes I had watched during our lessons. The same curvature of letters. The same faint indentation from years of writing the same way. But this page looked older. More tired. More desperate. Underneath the cipher he had scrawled something else, something almost illegible, as if written in haste. This is the last one I ever decoded. Finish it. Destroy the page. Then forget you ever knew me. My throat tightened painfully. Forget him? After everything he taught me? After everything he revealed? After seeing the fear behind the silence he carried? Absolutely not. But the cipher, the uncompleted one, stared back at me. The numbers were disorganized, frantic, unlike the calm structure he always insisted upon. A message written under duress. Or worse, in fear. My pencil hovered over the paper as hours passed. I worked through each sequence, each shift, each symbol, until my head pounded and my fingers cramped. But finally, close to midnight, the message revealed itself. And it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't instructions to leave him behind. It was a location. A time. And one final line. Come alone. I shouldn't have gone. Every rational part of me screamed not to. But curiosity, or loyalty, or something deeper pulled me forward. The location was an old park bench near the edge of our neighborhood. A place I had never seen him visit. The night was cold, the kind of cold that crept into your bones no matter how tightly you held your coat. He was already there. Sitting. Waiting. Small beneath the weight of everything he carried. When he saw me, a tired smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I knew you would come, he said. You asked, I replied. No, he corrected gently. I trusted you. He didn't waste time. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small metallic object, a flash drive, old and scratched. This, he said, placing it in my hand, is everything I never told you. My history. My mistakes. The people I couldn't save. And the promises I broke. I stared at it in disbelief. Why me? He exhaled, not with weakness, but with resignation. Because someone has to carry the truth, he said quietly. And you know how to listen between the lines. For a moment, he looked past me, into the empty night. That frequency wasn't a threat, he said. It was a request. Someone from the old world needed help. But I am too old for this war, too old for the ghosts that keep calling. He looked at me again, eyes sharp despite the age. You, however, are not. The wind rustled the trees as the words settled. You're choosing me? I whispered. No, he said. You chose yourself the first time you knocked on my door. A long silence passed, this time warm, not heavy. Then he stood, slower than before, and placed a hand on my shoulder. You wanted to learn, he said. Now you have to decide what to do with what you've learned. Will I see you again? I asked. His expression softened, bittersweet, fragile. Not in this lifetime. He turned and walked away into the darkness, no sound, no hesitation, slipping back into the shadows where he had lived most of his life. The streetlight flickered once as he passed beneath it, then steadied when he disappeared. I knew then the truth. He wasn't hiding from the past. He was finally leaving it. And he had handed the remainder, all its codes, its ghosts, its unfinished stories, to me. I looked down at the flash drive. Cold. Heavy. Alive with secrets. The night air felt different now, thinner, sharper, like the world had shifted a few degrees off its axis. I walked home slowly, each step echoing like a new beginning I hadn't asked for but somehow knew I needed. Inside my house, my radio remained silent. No static. No tapping. No voices from the past clawing through the airwaves. Only one sound filled the room. The soft click of the flash drive sliding into my computer. A message appeared on the screen. A single line of text. Lesson 1 was never about ciphers. It was about learning to see. And with that final lesson, the world I knew collapsed into 1,000 hidden layers. And I stepped into all of them,